The moment the spotlight slid down the slightly stooped shoulders of Tommy Shannon, people immediately sensed an impossible paradox. This was a man who always stepped half a pace back, avoiding every gaze. Yet behind that quiet, withdrawn posture was a life fractured far deeper than any mournful Texas blues ballad. How could someone so few of words have walked through the fire of Woodstock, reached the grandeur of Carnegie Hall, only to sink into the depths of addiction, jail, and those bitter days when he had to abandon music just to survive? What turned him into the loyal shadow behind Stevie Ray Vaughan, silently lifting a genius into legend, only to witness the moment a helicopter shattered against the Alpine Valley hillside, as if tearing away a piece of his own heart? Tommy Shannon's journey was never the path of an ordinary musician. It was an epic of a soul forever pulled between light and darkness, between steadfast bass lines and storms that refused to rest. You are about to enter a story where every turning point carries a rumor, a misplaced memory, a truth never fully revealed. And the final question that lingers is this: what keeps a man standing when life has tried every way it can to break him? Tommy Shannon was born Thomas Lafitte Smedley on April 18, 1946 in Tucson, a place where afternoons passed so slowly you could almost hear the dust moving in the sunlight. In a house without a single musical instrument, where night brought nothing but the creak of wooden chairs and the wind slipping through door cracks, the boy would lie still on his bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to every tiny sound, as if it were trying to tell him something. When the family moved to Dumas, the Texas sky felt so vast it made him squint each morning, a space so wide that just standing alone in the yard made him feel as though he were being pulled backwards. In Dumas, the wind never tired. It lashed against the metal fences, creating a steady rhythm, rising and falling, like someone tuning the strings of a giant instrument. Tommy often sat behind the porch, hands wrapped around his knees, listening to the wind change its voice. He never mentioned it to anyone, but quietly realized that his body was beginning to find a pulse of its own in those gusts. The repetition of identical days sharpened his senses. Sometimes just the faint rattle of a window was enough to make him look up, as if someone had tapped him on the shoulder. One afternoon, in a dusty room at an acquaintance's house, Tommy found an old guitar. He picked it up only to see whether it was heavy or light. The rough strings cut into his fingertips, producing a harsh, brittle sound. But he kept his hand there, as if afraid that letting go would make the sound disappear forever. He didn't ask anyone how to play. Instead, each night he dragged the guitar into a corner, pressing his ear against the wood to hear the vibrations from within. On many nights, the strings slipped out of tune, the notes came out crooked, and he would frown, tilting his head as though waiting for an answer to emerge from the empty space between two tones. The Avengers were formed when Tommy was just 13. The kids gathered in a sweltering garage where the smell of engine oil and sweat tangled together. Each time Tommy plucked the strings, dust rose from the wooden floor, hovering in the air before settling back down. Their first gig had nothing more than a few friends swaying in the front row, some scattered whistles, and a crumpled $80 bill. But when Tommy stood backstage afterward and looked out, his chest burned with a strange sensation. It wasn't joy. It felt more like receiving a signal sent from somewhere impossibly distant. After graduating, he stuffed a few clothes into an old bag, tested his guitar strings one more time, and boarded a bus to Dallas. On the road, he leaned his head against the window, watching his reflection flicker with every bump, his fingers tapping his knee as if gripping something that must not be dropped. Dallas greeted Tommy with the smell of cigarettes, damp wooden floors, the clinking of glasses, and neon signs pouring light across the pavement. Each time he walked into a club, he was struck by the heat rising from the crowd. The air felt dense, as if someone had spilled something invisible into the room. Standing backstage, listening to other musicians play, Tommy often placed 2 fingers on his neck just to check whether his heartbeat was keeping up with the drums. Joining the new breed, then the young lads, Tommy grew accustomed to the burning sting at his fingertips after long nights of playing. Sometimes he would slip out the club's back door, stand alone in an empty parking lot, and draw a deep breath as if trying to shake off the smoke clinging to his clothes. The whole city seemed to breathe through the roar of engines and the sharp laughter of people who had drunk too much. Amid that chaos, he realized he was always half a step behind everyone, not to hide, but to listen more clearly. Uncle John Turner found Tommy one hazy night. When he tapped the drum rim to signal the start, he eyed the young man standing motionless, as if waiting for someone to flip a switch. Tommy replied with a soft pluck, just enough for the bass to tremble in the air and land perfectly on the beat. It was only a fleeting moment, but the slight nod from Uncle John told him he had slipped into a narrow space. Not everyone could fit through it. From then on, the nights felt different. Each time he stepped off stage, sweat running down his spine and his hands still trembling, Tommy would lean against a wall, eyes closed, letting the sound he had just played settle like dust. Dallas had never promised anything. Yet under the dim lights of its bars, amid the relentless noise, there were moments when Tommy felt as though something, or someone, was calling him forward, not through words, but through a low note hitting him square in the chest. But even as he began to find his footing, Tommy sensed he was standing on the edge of something larger. On certain nights after the crowd dispersed and silence replaced the applause, he would watch people drift away in exhausted quiet and wonder whether he could break past the walls of these bars. He had no idea that the thin thread connecting him to Uncle John, first woven in a smoky club, would soon pull him into the orbit of Johnny Winter, who would drag him into the real world of the blues. At that time, in his early 20s, Tommy held on to only one certainty: leaving Dumas had been the right choice. Dallas didn't promise safety, but it awakened something the small town never could, a feeling that he was actually living. The cars rushing through the night, the yellow lights swallowing shadows, the damp, cigarette-soaked stages, they stripped away the silence that had wrapped his childhood, opening a road ahead where music led the way but had yet to reveal its name. A road steeped in hope, yet hiding cracks Tommy would only understand later. There were nights in Dallas when he felt torn in 2 directions. On stage, he felt lifted, guided by the drums, the guitar, and the heat of the crowd. But once the backstage door closed, everything went dark, leaving him with a hollow ache he couldn't define. He kept playing with a focus that surprised even himself, as if the music were the only compass he had among people trying to drown their own sadness. Yet beneath the dim lights, he always sensed a border before him, one step toward believing he was born for this, another toward fearing music would erode under the weight of late-night drinks and unfamiliar faces. The joy of living through music and the anxiety of what lay ahead fused into something painfully beautiful, like 2 notes a half step apart, always wanting to touch, never quite resolving. Tommy didn't know that this imbalance was the warning sign of a far bigger door about to open, one that a single night at the Fog would push wide enough to change his life forever, brighter than anyone could imagine. The night Tommy walked into the Fog was no different from countless other bar visits in Dallas. Another temporary refuge for musicians and those seeking to forget. He merely wanted to see Uncle John Turner after a gig, with no plans and no clue that an ordinary moment was about to become a turning point. When the dim lights fell across Johnny Winter's shock of white hair and the first blues notes tore out like something dragged from the darkest corner of a bruised soul, Tommy froze. Johnny's sound was metallic and raw, yet filled with a hurt that seized the heart. Tommy stood amid the haze of alcohol and cigarette smoke, but felt none of it. The chatter dulled, the laughter faded, and the bar blurred before him. Nothing remained but the guitar slicing straight into a place he had always sought, yet never named. In that instant, he felt as though the truest part of himself was being reflected back through the hands of a stranger. After the show, Uncle John pulled Tommy over. Johnny stared at him, an expression somewhere between suspicion and an attempt to read the thoughts hidden behind that quiet exterior. When Johnny asked if he wanted to sit in and play, it felt like someone else answered for him, from some place deeper than fear. The fear was there. Fear of not being good enough, of falling behind, of losing his direction beyond Dallas. But belief won. For the first time in his life, he chose to step towards something he didn't yet understand. The harmony between Tommy, Johnny, and Uncle John arrived so quickly that even they were taken aback. With the formation of the progressive blues experiment, Tommy felt as though he were stepping into a world he had only ever watched from the outside. He was happy, yet the joy never felt whole. Beneath it lingered a vague fear. Did he deserve to stand beside these two? Was he merely an extra in a dream too big for him? Still, each rehearsal softened that anxiety. Whenever the three of them played together, Tommy felt himself dissolve into the shared rhythm. No longer the boy from a small town, no longer the kid playing in smoky bars, but a part of something being born. In 1968, when the group's first recording was completed, Tommy stood behind the studio glass with his palms drenched in sweat. Each time his fingers touched the bass strings, he felt a double heartbeat inside him, the fear of being left behind smoldering like an old shadow. And, facing it, the realization that for the first time in his life, he was creating something that might outlive every temporary stage and every dim bar that had shaped him. In that studio, Tommy understood that music had become the only force capable of freeing him from the feeling of forever being the latecomer. Then came the second lightning strike, a contract with Columbia Records. When Johnny signed the $600,000 deal, an amount that stunned the industry, Tommy stood beside him trying to appear calm. He was genuinely happy for Johnny and Uncle John, happy the way one feels when watching family step into the light. Yet somewhere deep inside, a tiny echo surprised him. A quiet fear that he was merely standing in the background, not big enough to keep pace with the roaring machine in front of him, a world vast enough to sweep him away without notice. 2 albums, Johnny Winter and Second Winter, arrived in 1969, and when Tommy heard his own bass lines come through the studio monitors, it felt like proof that he truly belonged. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't need to be the center. It was enough to know that his sound was no longer swallowed by the chaos of Dallas. And then, Woodstock. Stepping onto that legendary stage, standing behind Johnny before a sea of people that stretched to the horizon, Tommy felt as if his whole body lit up. Not the glow of fame, but the awakening of someone who once believed he was destined to remain in the shadows. The crowd roared like a massive wave, and Tommy gripped his bass, barely believing a kid from Dumas now stood in the heart of history. The music spun around them like a cyclone. Boundaries collapsed. Fear, doubt, inferiority. They were crushed beneath the raw force of blues rock erupting from the stage. Yet something quieter stirred inside him. In that moment, layers of emotion radiated through him like ripples on a lake. The thrill of seeing his work stand firm for the first time. The faint dread that one day it could all vanish. Gratitude toward those who made music worth living for. and a tiny hairline crack, an intuition that no matter how bright the path looked, it would not be smooth. But that night, not even the idea of cracks could reach him. Darkness had no place there, not while Woodstock shook like the earth itself was trembling to Johnny Winter's blues. His heart pounded with the guitar, synced with the breath of hundreds of thousands of bodies fused into one colossal living organism. Every worry turned to dust. In that moment, Tommy was no longer the nervous kid in the studio or the man afraid of being left behind. He stood at Woodstock as if the world had opened just to receive the bass notes pouring from his hands. Each pluck dissolved into a downpour of sound that soaked the valley. Each drum beat compelled him deeper into a realm where music became religion and the stage a blazing altar. He had never belonged anywhere more fiercely. Right then, he believed the light had chosen him. A rare, fragile, but blazing belief, strong enough to push aside every cloud still lurking at the edges of his life. But the light began to change before it even faded. The glory of Columbia Records had barely settled when the darker side of the blues crept in. Cold and sharp like a crack running across stone. After months on the road with Johnny Winter, waking to strings still ringing in his head, moving further each night from the ghosts of his youth, Tommy believed he had escaped the shadows. Early 1970 shattered that illusion. Johnny chose to join a new band with Rick Derringer, a perfectly logical move for his soaring career. But for Tommy, it felt like a blade cutting through the only anchor he had. It wasn't betrayal nor abandonment. It was simply the way artists' paths sometimes swerve so fast those behind them cannot keep up. One day, Tommy shared a stage with the man he had treated as a compass. The next, Johnny was gone, leaving a void large enough to swallow sound itself. The sense of being left behind hit Tommy so fast he barely recognized it. After massive shows, long roads, and cheers that lifted him meters above the ground, the silence that followed Johnny's departure felt unbearable. Tommy no longer knew where to place his next step, or whether music still had a place for him at all. With Uncle John Turner, he left Texas for San Francisco, where they tried to rebuild life through a new band. Crackerjack, chaotic, raw, but burning with energy. Bruce Boland, John Staheli, Jesse Taylor, names without a shared definition, yet when they stood together, they created a strange electricity America craved. Later, when Crackerjack returned to Austin, a skinny teenage kid sometimes appeared, Stevie Ray Vaughan, clutching a guitar bigger than he was, eyes that refused to bow. Tommy saw the boy, unaware that this would become the person he would be bound to for life. Still, no new beginning could drown out the growing turbulence inside him. Without the rhythm he once relied on with Johnny, Tommy fell into a void familiar to anyone who has stood beneath stage lights. A place where fear, self-doubt, and disappointment fuse into something impossible to separate. Drugs appeared like a shortcut, dangerous, gentle, destructive, but easy. Sleepless nights, foggy mornings, arrests, probation, rehab, relapse, it all repeated like a whirlpool determined to drag him under every time he tried to surface. The years trapped in the spiral of drugs and legal trouble slowly stripped Tommy of the feeling that he had ever belonged on a stage. His probation forbade him from setting foot in musical environments, like a blade severing him from the very limb that kept him alive. Instead of bass lines, he heard bricks shattering, trowels scraping mortar, and the strained breathing of laborers beside him. Some days, Tommy stood in the middle of a construction site, hands still trembling from chemicals, sweat stinging his eyes, and realized he had been away from music so long he wasn't sure he could find his way back. No one knew what he thought in those moments, but everyone who met him later recalled the same thing. Something in his eyes was hard to face, a tiredness unique to someone who had once touched the light and now was learning to live in the dark as if it were predestined. Yet darkness, no matter how complete it seems, always leaves a seam for those who haven't fully surrendered. In 1977, when his final legal restrictions were lifted, Tommy stepped out of that forbidden zone, like a man relearning how to breathe. The stage reappeared, distant at first, then familiar again as he played with Rocky Hill and Alan Haynes. Each time he stood before an amp, Tommy tested himself. Would music still accept him? Would the past grant him a second chance? The answer didn't come all at once. It came quietly, in the simple realization that he could still keep time, still summon that hidden current that made his heart want to beat in rhythm. Then one night in Houston, fate cracked open the door again. Tommy heard Stevie Ray Vaughan was playing at Rockefeller's, a name that pulled back the memory of the skinny teenager who once played in Austin's version of Cracker Jack, clutching a guitar too big for his body, and playing. Like every note was proof he had been born to burn. Tommy remembered that image vividly, yet through the years of being lost, he never imagined he would see him again. He walked into Rockefeller's that night with a simple intention: to see what had become of that boy. No one packed into the room knew that the moment unfolding before them would alter the course of two lives standing on opposite sides of the stage. When Stevie stepped out, lights cutting across his tangled black hair and the strat hanging loose off his shoulder, Tommy understood something the crowd had not yet caught up to. Stevie was no longer that kid. He had become a force, a Texas blues spirit unleashed, wild, instinctive, purified, as though every note he played was pain forged into light. Tommy froze during the first song. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe deeply. He could only listen. The guitar tore across the room, striking something ancient inside him. The part that had trembled the first time he heard Johnny Winter, the part that once stood in the jaws of Woodstock, the part he thought had died beneath the weight of addiction. Everything collided, cutting through him in a single moment, and he felt as though he had rediscovered something he once lost without even saying goodbye. When the show ended, Tommy moved towards Stevie as though his body had made the decision for him. He had no speech prepared, only the certainty born from that first note. He belonged to this sound, this rhythm, this band that had reignited his heart in a way he thought impossible. Stevie looked at Tommy with an expression that made words unnecessary. Some people recognize each other not through conversation, but through the alignment of energies, as if every loose piece suddenly clicked into place. There were no tests, no negotiations, just an instinctive understanding that they had stepped into the most important chapter of their lives. That moment isn't recorded in bold letters in music history, but for Tommy, it was the point where every lost bass line found its meaning again. From that second on, Double Trouble didn't merely gain a bassist. Stevie Ray Vaughan found the anchor he had been missing, and Tommy Shannon found a rebirth most lives never grant twice. Once Tommy took his place in Double Trouble, the band's sound seemed to locate the breath it had been waiting for. Stevie Ray Vaughan played like he was burning away pieces of himself, while Chris Layton held the drums with the precision of someone who knew a single misstep would bring everything down. Between those two fires, Tommy became the equilibrium, the quiet force that held everything together. No one needed to say it aloud. Everyone could feel the solidity radiating from his bass. In their earliest shows, small clubs, sticky floors, low ceilings, it was already clear Double Trouble played as though they had been together forever. Tommy didn't try to shine. He focused on holding the pulse with a steadiness that made the whole band flow like a single current. Whenever Stevie launched into unpredictable improvisations, he would glance back, not for permission, but to feel the familiar anchor waiting behind him. One slight nod from Tommy, and the whole band ignited along a new trajectory. As stages grew and crowds swelled, the hidden beauty in Tommy's approach revealed itself. He was not the center, yet he was the reason the music had weight, compression, and a foundation firm enough never to crack. The audience might not have known how to explain it. They only felt that Double Trouble was bound together by an invisible force, deep and unyielding. That force was Tommy's bass, low, thick, restrained, yet gripping the soul of Texas blues. Tommy stepped back into his familiar place not out of modesty, but because he understood that their music required balance from the rear. In the band's brightest years, each note he played didn't just lift Stevie higher, it rebuilt pieces of himself he thought were gone forever. At the height of their rise, Tommy could bend over his old Fender and recognize something undeniable. He was finally standing exactly where he was meant to stand, in the one place where music allowed him to exist completely. But as the music grew sharper, the fractures in their lives began to show. Endless gigs, caravans of buses crawling across hundreds of miles, nights so long the mind couldn't recover. Everything fused into an exhaustion no one dared to name. Alcohol, pills, and then stronger things appeared first as support, later as the very glue holding their existence together. Tommy, always the quiet one, carried all that pressure in silence. He never complained. He simply tried to remain upright through every night. Stevie was the same. On stage, he burned so brightly he could no longer sense his body breaking down, and backstage, his eyes sometimes drifted as though reality were slipping away from him. The decline seeped into every show, like dust falling into the same crack. A heavier breath than usual, a faint tremor in the hand, a momentary lapse of focus. Tommy noticed all of it, and he noticed himself becoming part of that same trajectory. Darkness didn't rush from ahead. It seeped in from every direction, slow but certain. One night, just off stage, Stevie collapsed as though someone had drained him of everything. The roar of the audience still boomed beyond the curtain, but for Tommy, it felt like all the air had been sucked from the room. He looked at the friend who had just burned like a comet moments before, now gasping for breath, then glanced at his own trembling hand and understood. They were no longer facing a matter of stamina or mood. If they kept feeding the machine, they would lose something more precious than music itself, the right to stay alive. Late that year, they made a choice few artists at their peak dare to make. They stepped away from the stage to save themselves. Tommy and Stevie entered rehab in separate cities, without arranging it, without discussing plans. Still, their journeys mirrored each other uncannily. Bodies refusing command, minds hollowed out as though a part of the soul had been removed, and the fear that once they emerged, they might not recognize who they were anymore. Time inside rehab moved so slowly it made each day feel like a week. Tommy was forced to get used to absolute silence, the very thing he had avoided for years through music. With no drums to anchor him, no guitar to drown the dark corners, he faced himself in the barest form possible. Somewhere else in America, Stevie was drowning in the same deep water. Even apart, a silent thread still bound them. No calls, no meetings. Yet both knew the other was fighting every day not to be pulled back into the abyss. When they returned to rehearsal, the world was just as loud as before. But they were not. Tommy laid his hand on the bass string and heard a tone so deep and steady it startled him. It was no longer the sound of chaos pulling him along. It was the breath of someone who had climbed out of a grave. That certainty spread to Stevie and Chris. And when the three locked together again, It felt like men who had survived drowning. From that moment, Double Trouble entered its resurrection. Music no longer existed to fill a void. It existed to prove they were still alive, still capable of standing. And when they recorded In Step, everything snapped into clarity. Stevie played with a sobriety so sharp it felt like light. Chris hit the drums like a heart newly recalibrated, and Tommy's bass became the lifeline, clean, deep, and almost free of scars. In Step was not just an album, it was evidence they had survived the storm. The shows that followed carried the quiet power of people who had lost everything and found themselves again. Audiences saw them at the peak of their craft, but few realized every note hung by a thread woven from what nearly broke them. When the album carried them to a Grammy, Tommy watched Stevie on stage and understood. This victory wasn't about fame. It was about survival. It was proof that even souls cracked open at the bottom can return stronger, clearer, blazing. The revival that In Step brought felt like the first light after years of darkness. Tommy found his breath again and realized he and Stevie had entered a rare chapter of adulthood they once believed they'd never reach. But that light existed for only a fleeting moment before it was shattered. On August 27, 1990, at Alpine Valley, when Stevie stepped onto the fog-covered helicopter, Tommy had no idea he was seeing his friend for the last time, the man who had dragged him out of the abyss over and over. From behind the venue, laughter and remnants of the show still echoed in the night air. Moments later, the news arrived. No explosion, no chaos, just a silence so cold it split Tommy's world in two. Tommy froze, as though someone had drained gravity from his body. Stevie was gone. No more sharp, weary eyes. No more guitar that lit entire rooms. No more familiar nod before diving into the unknown. A void opened in Tommy, but unlike any he'd known. It wasn't loneliness, not ordinary grief. It felt like part of his inner architecture, part Stevie understood better than anyone, had been snapped at the root. For days afterward, Tommy lived as if emotionally suspended. He tried picking up his bass, but the sound chilled him. Not because it was wrong, but because it no longer connected to anything inside him. Music, once his refuge and equilibrium, now felt like an instrument of torment. Every note was a reminder that the only person who truly heard his bass, the only one who understood the pulse beneath those low notes, was gone forever. People told him to keep playing, to honor Stevie. But Tommy couldn't turn his grief into spectacle. Stevie wasn't a bandmate or a star to him. Stevie was the witness to the parts Tommy hid from the world. The only person who knew what Tommy had sacrificed to stand on stage. A man who had sat in rehab in another city, yet fought the same battle without a single word shared. Losing Stevie meant losing the mirror that reflected Tommy's deepest self. No one else looked at him with that wordless understanding. No one else stood on stage and turned back with eyes asking silently, "We still believe in this, right?" That rupture made Tommy feel lifted out of his own life, like a man evicted from the very story he helped build. For months afterward, Tommy couldn't force himself to listen to any Stevie recordings. A few seconds of footage was enough to make his chest implode. What once was pride now became a blade, reminding him of a truth his mind refused to accept. Stevie would never walk back into the room. Tommy later admitted that music felt as meaningless as the sound of a chainsaw. Not because he hated it, but because it no longer sheltered him. Every note, every pause reflected an absence too sharp, too cruel. Music now existed only to display the void Stevie left behind. What devastated Tommy wasn't just losing a friend, it was losing the part of himself that only existed when they stood side by side. A part of him vanished with Stevie. So quiet, it made no sound. yet so deep, nothing could ever reach it. There are tragedies that end a life. And then there are quieter ones. The kind that leave the living to relearn how to exist, how to breathe, how to keep their feet on the ground without shattering with every step. Tommy belonged to the second kind. He moved through his days like someone who had slipped out of his own life, wanting to pick up the bass, yet terrified that doing so would betray the memory of the friend who was gone. It took a very long time before he could lay his hand on the strings without trembling at the thought that the sound might push Stevie another step further away. Then, one day, when the pain no longer crashed like a wave but smoldered like a cut that never quite healed, Tommy realized he could not remain suspended in that emptiness forever. Not because he had overcome the loss, but because silence, when stretched too long, becomes a different kind of darkness, one that swallows more fully than grief ever could. His body still remembered the vibration of the bass. His hands still found their familiar place along the neck. Only his heart was not yet ready. But life doesn't wait. Music doesn't either. While Tommy wrestled with the wreckage inside him, those once bound to Stevie, Chris Layton, Doyle Bramhall II, Charlie Sexton, were fighting their own versions of the same void. They met at the Austin rehearsal complex like survivors returning from a storm. No one finished their sentences. No one spoke directly of the sadness. Yet everyone recognized the identical emptiness staring back at them. What began as playing to kill the silence slowly became a current of something new, gentle but potent, as if the music itself was trying to stitch together what had been torn apart. Tommy hadn't set out to form another band. He only wanted to know if he could still exist inside sound. But it was precisely that restraint that opened the door to Archangels. Not a continuation of Double Trouble, not Stevie's shadow, but a space where fractured hearts could find a new rhythm. For the first time in months, music didn't make Tommy choke. The Archangels carried Doyle's restless youth, Charlie's razor edge, Chris's heartbeat steady drums, and Tommy's grounded stillness. It wasn't healing yet, but it was a first step out of the dark, like learning to walk again after a devastating fall. Yet Archangels flickered like a passing streak of light. Internal fractures pulled the band apart, and Tommy once again stood at a familiar crossroads. This time he refused to fall. The loss of 1990 had taught him that stillness can be a form of drowning. Then came Storyville, a short chapter, but enough for Tommy to gather the scattered pieces of himself. And when that journey quieted, he didn't collapse into the darkness as he once had. Instead, he entered a gentler silence, where music returned to him in small, subtle melodies that felt like something long misplaced finally finding its way home. In the quiet Austin afternoons, Tommy discovered the one desire that remained, to stand beside Chris Layton once more. Not to resurrect Double Trouble, but to prove their voices still belonged to the present. No grand plans, no declarations. They both understood it was time. Being a long time was born in that spirit, an unforced return so true that friends like Willie Nelson, Dr. John, Jimmy Vaughan, Eric Johnson, Kenny Wayne Shepherd, Johnny Lang, Susan Tedeschi, and others came on their own. They didn't gather to boost Double Trouble's legacy. They came out of respect for two men who had been broken and still chose to rise. In the studio, Tommy's bass carried something he had never possessed before, the peace of someone who has survived the storm and no longer fears it. By the time Double Trouble and friends lit up the Austin Music Hall, Tommy stood behind his familiar bass and understood the simplest truth. He had returned not for glory, but to prove that music still had a place for him, even after pain had tried to erase his very existence. The road that led Tommy to Storyville began with a different kind of light, Not Stevie's wildfire, not Archangel's ignition, but something quiet, warm, and deep, like the final breath of a Texas evening. With Malford Milligan, David Grissom, Chris Layton, and David Holt, he stepped into a musical space with less fury, less self-destruction, but far more humanity. Storyville wasn't chasing headlines. They crafted a sound steeped in time, made by people who had lost enough to understand the value of peace. In Malford's husky voice, in Grissom's layered guitar, in Chris's unwavering drums, Tommy set his bass down as though placing his heart back where it belonged after years of tremors. Storyville didn't heal him entirely, but it taught him not to fear the past, a victory understood only by those who have stood at the edge of ruin. On the night Austin Music Hall glowed under Double Trouble and Friends, Tommy walked off stage with a strange sense of calm, not triumph, not nostalgia. Simply the knowledge that he had traveled far enough to return to the one place still made for him. Stevie was gone. Their years as a duo sealed forever, but music, astonishingly, remained open to him, softer and kinder than before. In the silence after the show, Tommy grasped what most people never do, every rise and collapse he had endured, from Woodstock's blaze to the cold of jail cells, from the heights of stages to the depth of loss, had fused into the sound of the bass he played now. No theatrics, no spotlight, yet his presence alone was strong enough to keep the entire band upright. People felt it through their ears, through their pulse, through the way the air shifted each time he touched a string. Tommy's influence never came from standing at the center. It came from his ability to make whoever was at the center shine. For Stevie, he was the ground beneath the guitar's wings, a place where the notes could leap without fear of falling. For the younger generation of musicians, he was proof that blues isn't born from noise, but from living truth all the way to its raw edge. For those who played beside him, a single bass note from Tommy was enough to quiet the room, as though chaos itself had finally found a place to dissolve. In the years that followed, no matter how many projects he joined or how many stages honored him, Tommy kept his familiar way of living, stepping half a pace back, speaking little, letting music speak instead. People remembered him not for the noise around his name, but for the sense of safety that settled in whenever his bass appeared, low, deep, and carrying the weight of a man who had fallen more than once but never let himself stay at the bottom. On the map of Texas blues, some are remembered for the light they cast. Tommy Shannon is remembered for the silence he held, the silence that gave an entire era its shape without needing to shout to be seen. Across decades of shifting sounds and losses that forced him into adulthood far sooner than any man deserves, Tommy carried within him a private space the stage could not touch. For years, that space was hollow, the place where Stevie once stood, the path his youth left behind, the doorway he was afraid to enter for fear that the peace inside would collapse like it had before. But life, even at its harshest, always hides an opening for those who choose to rise again. For Tommy, that opening did not appear during a triumphant encore or a roaring crowd. It appeared in the stillness between tours when he realized he no longer wanted to walk through the rest of his life alone. Love didn't storm into Tommy's world. It arrived like a hand, resting gently on an old wound, not erasing it, but easing its ache. Kumi came at the moment he needed an anchor, not made of music, but of another human being, someone who could see the man behind the stage lights, with his fractures, fragility, and the chapters of his life he assumed no one could ever touch. They loved quietly, steadily, without grand declarations. Kumi didn't love Tommy's legend. She loved the way he bowed over his bass as though holding the world together one note at a time. Tommy didn't love an image. He loved the stillness within her. the same stillness he had been chasing through years of noise. In 1986, amid the chaos of double trouble and a relentless war with addiction, Tommy and Kumi were married. It wasn't grand. There was no stage, no fireworks, no sweeping vows. Just two people who had walked too far down separate lonely roads, agreeing that from now on, neither would walk alone. That marriage became the rare harbor Tommy could trust the way he trusted the pulse beneath his fingers. When the music soared, she was there. When touring hollowed him out, she was there. When Stevie died and Tommy's world split open, Kumi held the part of him that was still breathing, the part drowning in grief, confusion, and a void no sound could fill. Not every day was calm. Sometimes the old darkness slipped back in, pulling Tommy toward the silence he once feared. There were nights when he sat for hours without speaking, listening only to his heartbeat as proof he was still anchored to something. Through all of it, Kumi stayed, not urging, not demanding, simply holding steady. Her presence became a quiet breath, soft but strong enough to keep him from slipping again. It was a safety music, despite having saved him many times, had never given him. Over time, their bond became the quiet sky behind Tommy's every journey. From the shaky steps out of rehab to the late-period revival with Double Trouble, from musical projects built like mosaic pieces after loss to evenings spent peacefully at home, unafraid of the dark beyond the door. If his career offered him both blinding heights and bottomless valleys, Kumi gave him a place to return to, a home not for hiding from the world, but for living honestly inside it. In recent years, Tommy's life slowed, until the world finally seemed willing to move at his pace. No more cross-country drives, no more tour schedules, no more nights forcing his body to chase the roar of a crowd. He lives in Austin as though he were part of its memory. So quietly, you might mistake him for the neighbor who likes morning coffee and late sunlight drifting across the porch. A man who once played before thousands now strolls through the park, adjusts the strings on an old bass in his living room, and occasionally drops into sessions with younger musicians to teach them the pulse he carried his entire life. There is nothing left to prove. No spotlight to chase. Tommy plays only when his heart has enough sound left to touch the strings. And strangely, that calm draws more people to him, like water that has survived many storms and now knows how to flow without resistance. When Tommy speaks of the past, he doesn't recount what he lost or the heights he reached. He recalls small things, a baseline that saved him from a dark day, a hand that landed on his shoulder when he was about to collapse, a home that only asked whether he was breathing easy. Perhaps that is why, though time has pushed the glory behind him, his presence remains. Quiet, steady, like the bass notes that have followed him more than half a lifetime. And now, as life settles into its natural rhythm and no one urges him to outrun himself, Tommy Shannon stands as the final shape of a soul that learned to remain upright through silence. He lives by a sound distilled from every storm he ever endured, and in that endurance, he leaves us with a question that refuses an easy answer. What keeps a person tied to music, even when music once hurt them the most? Sometimes I think of it when I see Tommy rest his hand on the strings, not playing yet, just listening to the faint vibration beneath his fingertips. Perhaps the answer is in that moment, small enough to miss if you blink, when someone chooses not to let go. And perhaps not letting go is enough to light the path for everyone who comes after.